Okay, so once again, good evening, everyone. So today we'll talk about the manufacturing business first. So last time we had the introduction or the discussion on the different types of costs. So this time, let's have an overview of the manufacturing business. Remember, in your basic accounting, you had the merchandising and the service types of businesses. This time, the focus of cost accounting is on the manufacturing business. All right, so study objectives. So at the end of this first session, we will have the understanding or deeper understanding on the different types of business organization according to activities. And we will have the introduction, of course, on the manufacturing business, the nature, the chart of accounts, what's the difference between the chart of accounts under the merchandising with that of the manufacturing business, and also the operating cycles. Okay, and the types of the businesses are the services or trade. Number 2 is trader or merchandising. Number 3 is manufacturing, or if you are a manufacturer. Okay, sometimes you call it trader or trading for merchandising. For services, that's the activity. The activity is actually we are selling people's time. It's more on labor. So we hire the skilled staff and sell their time. So examples are, syempre, wag na tayo lumayo, the accounting, the legal, and the software development. Okay? And with the next one, trading or merchandising, kilala na naman natin to. That's the time that we buy and sell the products. So we buy goods and then we make them available for sale. Yung mga goods na to, saleable na kasi talaga siya. Pero if we do modification, may konting modification lang and then available for sale na agad yung mga products na to. So examples are wholesaler, retailer, mga supermarkets, and all. Okay? With the manufacturing business, so the activity is we design the products, aggregating the components, and assembling the finished products. So here, we take the raw materials, we use all the equipment and the staff to convert those raw materials into finished goods. Yun yung difference na with merchandising, because here, we convert raw mats to finished goods. We produce what we are selling. So here, there are a lot of examples here, the vehicle assembly, construction, engineering, electricity, and etc. Okay, so 3 major legal forms of a business. So that includes the sole proprietorship, the partnership, and the corporation. And in general, the accounting process is the same for all these 3 forms of businesses. Okay, di pa pala lumitaw si corporation. And then, nagbabagal ng konti. Ayan. So what is a sole proprietorship? Just a quick review lang. So this one, a sole proprietorship is a business entity owned by one person, and the life of the business ends when the owner is no longer willing or hindi na siya able to keep the business ongoing. So many small businesses are operated as sole proprietorship. Okay, so ilan ang owners? Isa. It ends when the owner is unable to carry on, or pag namatay siya, or pag na-close na yung firm, or pag nalugi na. So that's the time the life of the sole proprietorship ends. Okay, so the responsibility for the business debts, if firm is unable to pay, kay owner po lahat ng yun. Okay. So partnership naman, just to recall, partnership is a business entity owned by 2 or more people who contribute actually their money, property, or industry into a common fund. Ang purpose natin is to divide the profits among these partners. So we're done with the partnership and corporation as subject before. So this is just a review. So partnership, there are 2 or more na mga owners. Yun nga lang, the life of the partnership, madali siyang ma-dissolve, di ba? Whenever one partner may intention to withdraw, o kaya may namatay, hindi naman natin mapipigilan na may mamamatay na partner, so immediately, madi-dissolve yung partnership. So kung gusto nila ituloy yung business, magre-register na naman ulit sila. Okay? So also the partnership ends kapag nag-close, maybe because of the bankruptcy. So ang responsibility naman for the business debts, remember, if firm is unable to pay, partners are responsible whether individually or jointly. Okay? So sa ang mga partnership naman na typical that we have, we have the medical practices, we also have the dental practices, may mga architectural firms, may mga accounting firms, syempre wag na tayo lumayo, and also law firms. Okay, some professional services na typically ang type ng business niya ay, or ang form ng organization niya ay partnership. Okay, di ba? SGV, yung ating big four, some of them are partnership. Okay, so at the beginning of the partnership, syempre, the two or more individuals enter into a contract that details the rights, the obligation, pati yung limitation ng bawat partner, including the amount of each partner na i-contribute nila to the business. Also, the percentage of ownership of each partner. Kasama na rin yung share of profits. Pero ano nga ba ang sharing ng profit kapag hindi kasama sa agreement? So that would be divided according sa kanilang capital contribution. And also, ano ba yung duties ng bawat partner? Meron bang managing partner? Meron bang industrial partner? And so on. So the debts are, it has to be agreed also, yung responsibility ng bawat partner for the partnership's debts. Okay? So next is the corporation. Review ng corporation lang. So corporation is a publicly or privately owned business entity that is separate from its owners and has a legal right to own the property and to do the business in its own name. So stockholders are responsible for the debts or taxes of the businesses. So corporations are different from sole proprietorships and partnership. A corporation is a separate legal entity. So it can be one or thousands. One kasi meron na po tayong sole corporation, di ba? And then there could be thousands of owners ng corporation. Di naman sila magkakakilala. Unlike the partnership, dapat merong mutual agreement. So hindi ka makikipag-partner sa isang individual na merong nagdi-disagree na partner na ma-accept siya sa partnership. Sa corporation, it doesn't matter kung magkakakilala o hindi. And most of the time, hindi sila magkakakilala. Okay? Excuse me. So, a corporation may have one, sabi ko nga, owner or thousands of owners. So, our corporation also is acquired usually by buying shares of its stock. And one of the advantages ng isang corporation is the indefinite life. So the business goes bankrupt, the stockholders vote to liquidate. Yun lang yung mga situation na mag-e-end na yung life ng corporation. Okay? So also the stockholders can lose only the amount invested, unlike the partners, up to the personal na assets ng mga general partners, di ba? Ang sole proprietorship up to the personal din na net worth or assets nung sole proprietor pwede po makuha in case na kulang pa yung pambayad ng obligation sa mga creditors niya. Ayan. So, stock, let's just reintroduce the stock. This is issued in the form of stock certificates and represents the ownership of the corporations. So di ba nga, the corporations may be privately or publicly owned. Yung mga stock ownership of private-owned corporations, usually limited yan sa mga specific individuals, usually mga family members, yung mga privately owned corporation. In contrast naman sa public corporation, yung stocks ng mga publicly owned corporation are bought and sold on stock exchanges. And yung iba naman sa mga over-the-counter ng mga markets. So if you own a common stock in a corporation, then bilang owner, you have the right to vote at the stockholder meetings. So if the corporation is unable to pay its bills, yung namang most of the stockholders can lose their investment in the stocks. So an owner's share of the corporation is determined by the number of shares of stocks held by the owner compared to the total number of shares issued by the corporation. So most large corporations have issued millions of shares of stocks. Ayan. So important distinction lang. For accounting purposes, all forms of business entities are considered separate entities. Lahat naman po, sole, partnership, or corporation. However, the corporation is the only form of the business that is a separate legal entity. So in the eyes of the law, a corporation is just an artificial na person, di ba? So kaya nga separate legal entity. So it has the legal right to own the property and to do business in its own name. So it's important that whatever form of the business any business would take, whether it's a corporation, partnership, or sole proprietorship, its financial records and transactions are kept separately from the owner of from the owner's personal transactions. So dapat hiwalay talaga. So that is the assumption that we call separate entity assumption. So here, the separate entity assumption is the concept of keeping a firm's financial records separate from the owner's personal financial records. Hindi pwede na yung sariling Meralco bill ng owner ay magiging part ng financial statements ng mga companies. So dapat nakahiwalay po yun. That is just an example na maybe when you go into practice someday, baka kapag ang naging employer nyo is a sole proprietorship or sole proprietor, so baka yung iba, yung mga personal nila ng mga bills and expenses are being included in the financial records. Please remember yung ating separate entity assumption. Okay? So at this point, let's have the distinction or the emphasis on the nature of the manufacturing business. Actually, the manufacturing business at ang merchandising business, as far as the selling of goods is concerned, selling of goods at markup is concerned, parehas lang sila. The main difference lies on the accounting of the cost of market. In merchandising, ang cost of sale natin ay yung cost mismo ng merchandise that we purchase. Of course, including the freight in and the cost, meaning the cost in bringing such merchandise to the business place. Di ba? So, kumbaga, in other words, yun yung puhunan natin in the merchandising. That's the cost of your sale. Pero in manufacturing, remember in our discussion on the types of cost, ang cost of sale ng under manufacturing business would begin from the conversion of raw mats into finished goods. So that would include the materials, the labor, and your overhead. Yun yung difference niya with the merchandising. And moreover, naka-highlight naman dito, may major investment po ang manufacturing because that would require you that if you are the one to produce whatever you are going to sell, that would require you to have physical facilities such as the factory site, the building, the acquisition of the PPEs ng machines and equipments that you are going to use in your factory in producing your products. So yun yung nature ng manufacturing business. And look at the chart of accounts of a manufacturing business. So we have here, naka-highlight po or naka-red po yung only difference niya with the merchandising. Parehas po lahat except for these three. These are the inventories that we have in manufacturing business. We have the finished goods, we have the work in process, and the raw materials. Pero sa merchandising business, we have the merchandise inventory. Okay? And also, sa cost of goods sold, parehas sila na merong cost of goods sold. But then again, the components of the cost of goods sold ng manufacturing and merchandising ay magkaiba. Okay? So let's talk about the operating cycle of the manufacturing business. So here are the steps, or actually ito ay kaya tinawag na cycle, paikot-ikot po na nangyayari. So everything, of course we need cash. for us to operate our business. Pero what do we do with our cash? The first one is we buy the raw materials. Okay, once we have the raw materials, we will proceed with the phase 2. These raw mats will be processed to finished goods. Okay, then after that, once done is completed, we are going to sell the finished goods to the customers, and then we collect from the customers, so we have our cash again. And we will be using our cash again to buy the raw materials, and then again process the raw mats to finished goods, sell the finished goods, collect again, and then paikot-ikot po. Kaya nga we call it cycle. So that's the operating cycle of the manufacturing business. Okay, so here are the cost elements, reintroducing the cost elements of manufacturing business because we have discussed this in our previous meetings. So raw materials, these are the direct materials used in the production. Medyo napag-usapan na natin before, what's the difference between the direct materials and indirect materials. We also have direct labor, and of course, we have the factory overhead. I hope you can still remember the T-RUD in the factory overhead. I-recall lang natin, T is for your taxes. These are the taxes that we pay that are related sa ating property na nandun sa factory. I for your indirect materials, your indirect labor, at ano pa isang letter I? That's your insurance. Pero the expired portion. Insurance, of course, ng mga nandun lang sa factory natin. Letter R is for rent. We are renting the building that we are using for the factory, and also the repairs and maintenance. Of course, we need to maintain the machines that we use in our production to ensure the smooth operation. Okay, U, kilala natin, the utilities, and of course, D, depreciation expense that are related only to PPEs under the factory. Okay, so nireview lang natin yung ating cost elements. And also, we have here the manufacturing cost. Yung manufacturing cost ay pinagsama-samang DM plus DL and your OH. Ibig sabihin, kaya nga, manufacturing costs, these are the costs that you need to come up with your products. That's why sometimes ang tawag sa kanya ay production cost or factory cost. So we also have here the work-in process. Ang work-in process, the portion of the total manufacturing cost that pertains to the goods under process. Actually, napaka-literal naman ng term which are not yet 100% completed. Sometimes we call it partially completed goods. Itong work-in process. Okay? And then we also have the cost of goods manufactured. From the term itself, manufactured na, completed na. Kaya ito yung portion of the total manufacturing costs pertaining to the work which is 100%. Kaya nga ita-transfer na natin to finished goods. Okay. So ito, the cost the blank and blank at the end of the period are the available inventories in the factory which should be reported as part of the current assets of the business. So let's reveal the answer. These are your unsold na finished goods. Kasi di ba yung mga finished goods natin, these are all available for sale. So yung mga maiiwan lang, that would be reported in your balance sheet, part of your current assets. Also, unfinished goods in process, yung mga work in process natin. And unused raw materials because the used raw materials ay nasa part na siya ng goods in process kung hindi pa completed yung ating products. So pag tinanong tayo ng total amount of inventory under the manufacturing businesses, tatlo po yung ito total natin. The finished goods na sold, the work in process, and then the unused raw materials. And just to compare with the merchandising business, sa merchandising, ang reported na current assets natin ay yung merchandise inventory that are unsold at the end of the period. Pero with the manufacturing businesses, so ito nga po yung tatlong sinabi natin. And ito po, meron pong ibang company na sinasama sa inventory but actually hindi siya considered as inventory. Because ang definition kasi natin ng inventory ay iba sa definition ng supplies. But some of the businesses, they put the factory supplies inventory, they put the word inventory there, pero hindi po talaga siya classified as inventory, but instead supplies. Magkaiba po yun. Okay? So, income statement. So, gusto lang natin i-emphasize yung cost, yung difference natin, di ba sabi natin nasa cost of goods sold. It differs only slightly from the cost of goods sold for the merchandisers. Ayan. Merchandising companies calculate cost of goods sold as beginning merchandise inventory plus the purchases minus your ending, that would be your sold. So beginning plus purchases minus ending is your sold. Okay? Pero sa kabilang side, sa manufacturing company, ang pinopurchase natin ay raw mats. But instead, to calculate the cost of goods sold, that is beginning plus P minus ending equals sold. Pero yung P dito is your produce. At ang produce natin dito, ang produce natin dito ay yung cost of goods manufactured. Okay? Naka-highlight po yung, naka-ibang color yung purchases at cost of goods manufactured. Because sometimes in the exam, tinatanong kung ano yung counterpart ng cost of goods sold sa merchandising. The counterpart is the purchases. Okay? So, yan yung difference natin with the cost of goods sold ng manufacturing and merchandising business. Okay. So at this point, ito yung pinag-usapan natin that we have to be clear on this para hindi natin minememorize yung paggawa ng statement of cost of goods manufactured and sold. We have to clearly understand the flow of the manufacturing cost. Ano ba ang kauna-unahang ginagawa natin when we are in a manufacturing business? The first one is we purchase the raw materials. So what do we do with the raw materials? We then issue the raw materials to production. So simple as that. And then what do we do with the raw materials? So we need the labor para ma-convert yung raw mats into finished goods. So we will incur the labor, but as cost accountants, we have to charge the labor to production. When you say charge the labor to production, that would be added to the work-in process. Okay? Number 5, we are going to incur, of course, the manufacturing overhead. Because remember, without labor and the manufacturing overhead, hindi naman po talaga mako-convert ang raw materials into finished goods. Okay? And number 6, we will charge the overhead to production. Gusto ko lang tingnan nyo po yung 2, 4, and 6. Yung number 2, we charge to production yung materials. Number 4, we charge the labor to production. We charge overhead to production. So parang yung 1, 3, and 5 naman, these are the elements. 2, 4, and 6, charge lang natin. Yun lang yung gusto mangyari sa flow of manufacturing cost. And once we are able to charge the overhead to production, kompleto na yung tatlong elements natin, ang next na mangyayari is the completion of your products. Okay? But once completed, ano na mangyayari? Ibebenta na po natin yung ating products. So typically, basically, yan ang flow ng manufacturing cost. At yung istorya po na yan, yan din po ang gagamitin mo para mabuo mo yung schedule of cost of goods manufactured and sold without memorizing its contents. Just remember the story, you can write the schedule ng maayos. Okay, so let's have the discussion ng bawat flow ng manufacturing cost. When we purchase materials, ano bang entry natin? So debit, sir, ano bang inventory system muna ang gagamitin natin? Although, yung discussion na mas malalim on the inventory system, we will do that in chapter 2. But right now, ano ba yung gagamitin natin in manufacturing businesses? Yung mga nakaraang basic accounting natin, ang ginamit po natin ay periodic. Wherein kapag naka-periodic inventory system tayo, whenever we purchase materials, whenever we purchase, we debit purchases. Pero this time with manufacturing businesses or in cost accounting rather, we will be focusing on the perpetual inventory system. So meaning we will be using the account raw materials inventory instead. Okay, we will use the inventory account sa movement ng ating mga inventory. Ayan. So debit raw materials inventory, and what do we credit? So depende, but usually the inventories or the raw materials are purchased on accounts. So the credit accounts payable. Okay? Pero sometimes there are inventories there are raw materials na may defects. So what do we do? So we return the materials. Anong entry natin pag nag-return tayo ng materials? Of course, the accounts payable would be reduced. However, the amount of raw materials include the invoice cost. Ano pa? Invoice cost kasama yung freight in. Okay? Kasama yung freight in for the amount of raw materials inventory. Pero, ang pwede mo lang i-deduct sa accounts payable mo ay yung may kinalaman sa invoice cost. Okay? One of the methods or one of the ways in accounting for the freight in, kapag nagkaroon ng return, we debit to manufacturing overhead yung portion ng freight in. And then we credit raw materials inventory. Remember kasi, ang madedebit mo lang na accounts payable would be pertaining only to invoice cost. So meron na kaagad tayong loss on that part, and that loss, since related sa raw materials inventory natin, would be included as part of your overhead also. Okay? So, pero we will go into details pagdating natin ng accounting for materials. So please remember this part. Okay? So once we are ready to issue materials to production, anong entry natin? Whenever there is issuance to production, we always debit work in process. Pero para sa raw materials na para sa direct materials. Pero kung ang raw materials ay indirect, we debit manufacturing overhead for the indirect materials and credit raw materials inventory. Kasi may mga companies na ang raw materials inventory magkasama ang direct materials and indirect materials. Kaya naman, when they issue to production the raw materials inventory, you have to identify how much ang direct, how much ang indirect. Because kapag direct, ide-debit sa work in process. Pag indirect, ide-debit sa manufacturing overhead. Remember, the indirect materials, part siya ng T-RUD natin sa overhead. Okay? So, ayan. But sometimes, yung inisyo mo sa production, sobra-sobra. That's why ibabalik mo sa warehouse or sa stock room yung ibang raw materials. Pag nagbalik ka, debit raw materials inventory for the total amount of raw mats na binalik. Pero sa binalik, meron palang direct, meron ding indirect. So syempre, i-credit mo ang work in process para sa mga direct materials na sinoli mo at i-credit mo ang manufacturing overhead para sa indirect materials na isasoli mo. Okay? I hope that's clear. Hindi po talaga nakadugtong to sa account nilagyan ko lang ng note. Okay? So yan, so materials yan. At this time, we will go to labor. Mag-i-incur muna tayo ng labor. Pag nag-incur ng labor, syempre pinag-uusapan natin factory labor lang muna. So what do we debit? Factory payroll. Okay? Anong credit natin? Actually, factory payroll, ang sa general accounting, ito yung salaries expense natin. Pero to be more specific na ito ay nasa factory, pwede naman siyang lagyan ng word na factory. Pag ginamit mo ay payroll, factory payroll is an expense account. Okay? Pag payroll lang ang ginamit mo, it is more general. That could include yung OPEX natin. Pero kapag factory payroll, very specific tayo na ito ay may kinalaman lang sa production area. Okay? Anong credit natin? Remember, marami tayong mga government payables. Hindi po ito yung specific account. Ano yung mga government payables natin, di ba? Ang sweldo ng mga empleyado, portion of that may deduction because of the SSS, because of the pag-ibig. Ano pa? Para po sa mga private companies, meron po tayong withholding taxes. Kaya naman yung government payables na to ay SSS payable, pag-ibig payable, PhilHealth payable, and withholding taxes payable. Ayan. Okay, so hindi lang natin nilagay dito kasi medyo maliit yung space natin. Pero ito yung mga nasa government payables. After all the deductions, makukuha na natin yung ating net pay ng mga empleyado. So ang net pay na yan would be the accrued payroll. Kaya pag nagbayad tayo nung net pay na yan sa mga empleyado, pag araw na ng sweldo, debit, accrued payroll, and credit cash. Okay? So when we incur labor, yan po yung ating entries. Ayan. This time, bilang cost accountant, we have to charge the factory payroll to production. Some of the payroll, sasabihin yan, 80% ay direct labor, 20% ay indirect labor. So, ang mangyayari dito, debit, work in process. Di ba sabi sa inyo, whenever you charge to production, may work in process dyan. Basta direct. Lagyan lang natin ang note na direct labor. Ano pa? Debit, manufacturing overhead para sa indirect labor. Anong credit natin? Parang nireclassify mo lang itong factory payroll into these two accounts, work in process and manufacturing overhead. Okay? Ayan. Sometimes, ang ginagawa po dito na i-merge na. Ibig sabihin, hindi na dumadaan sa entry sa number 3, ginagawa ng ibang accountant, debit, work in process agad para sa direct labor portion, debit, manufacturing overhead agad para sa indirect labor. Ang credit dito would be the government payables, diretso na po, and accrued payroll. Pwede po ba yan, sir? Pwede naman. Basta tandaan, kung ito ang ginamit mo, ito na mismo yun. Pero pag ito ang ginamit mo sa number 3, dito ka nagsimula, i-reclass mo po siya dito sa number 4. So sometimes, sa exam, baka ito ang makita, tama pa rin naman po siya. Kasi parang, or kinumbine mo lang yung entries natin sa number 3 and number 4. Okay? Ayan. If you have questions, you can utilize muna yung chat box natin, and also you can raise your hand. Tapos after each of the topic, tsaka tayo mag-entertain ng questions. Alright? So I'll just proceed. Ayan. So overhead naman po tayo. Ano ay overhead natin? Ito po yung ating TRUD. Pero yung I natin dito, if you remember, yung indirect materials and indirect labor nakasama na sa mga nauna nating transactions. So dito sa TRUD natin, debit, manufacturing overhead, kasi na-incur natin yung overhead. Anong credit natin? Credit, taxes, payable. Yung TRUD natin, ano pa yung ibang credit natin? Credit, prepaid insurance. Bakit prepaid insurance? Pero syempre po, depende kung naka-asset or expense method. Dito muna tayo generally. Okay? Mamaya tayo maging mas particular bakit ito ang entry natin. Bakit yung iba taxes expense sa halip na taxes payable? Bakit yung iba insurance expense sa halip na prepaid insurance? Tuloy muna natin. Ano pa yung iba? Credit cash minsan. Bakit cash? Kasi nagbayad ka ng rent for cash. Dinerecho kasi natin sa manufacturing overhead yung transaction. Ano pa? Utilities payable. Ano pa? Accumulated depreciation. Ayan. Kaya minsan makikita mo sa libro, debit MOH and credit various accounts kasi ang daming pwedeng manufacturing overhead na mai-incur. Okay. Pero bakit ba ganito ang nangyari? Isang example lang po, yung combination ng debit manufacturing overhead and credit accumulated depreciation. Okay? Bakit ito ang entry natin? Pwede po kasi na may ibang accountant na unang ginawa niya debit, depreciation expense. Kung anumang equipment yan. Okay? Credit, accumulated depreciation equipment. Nauna kasi yung general accountant na gawin yan. Kung ikaw si cost accountant, ang gagawin mo, i-reclass mo yung depreciation expense, debit, manufacturing overhead, and credit, depreciation expense. Ayan. Kung iba nag-entry nito, ito ang entry mo. Okay? Pero kung ikaw na cost accountant ang dediretso mag-entry niyan, pwede naman po na ito ang entry mo. Okay? Pag tinignan mo, depreciation expense, equipment here, nagka-cancel out po dito. Okay? So it's either merong reclass na mangyayari or diretso po tayo. Okay? Yan. Kaya baka mamaya sa exam, sir, bakit sa nakalagay accumulated depreciation? Pero bakit dito depreciation expense? It always depends on the entries kung meron man na initially nagawa. Okay? Itong cash na to, tingnan natin itong part na to. Debit, rent, expense, nagbayad ng rent, credit, cash. Okay? Yan ang entry ng accountant natin. Bilang cost accountant, anong entry mo? Debit, MOH, and credit, rent, expense. Ano nangyari? Yung rent expense talaga, nag-reclass lang po tayo. Anong naiwan? Debit, MOH, and credit, cash. So it's either ito ang gawin mo kung ikaw yung diretso na mag-entry niyan, or kapag may ibang nag-entry ng rent expense, re-reclass mo bilang cost accountant para ma-classify as overhead yung rent expense na attributable dun sa factory natin. Okay, so yun po yung pinag-ugatan ng various accounts na yan. Kasi too many to mention, yung mga accounts na yan, pag isa-isa, yun. Saka hindi po naman nangyayari palagi ng sabay-sabay yung mga yan. Pwede naman po, at the end of the period, i-reclass mo one time yung mga expenses. Ang clue dito, kapag nagre-reclass po tayo, okay, pag nagre-reclass tayo, debit MOH and credit yung expense account po. Pero kapag ikaw yung diretso na mag-e-entrada for manufacturing overhead na i-incur, debit MOH and credit, itong mga various accounts na to, yung mga payables or mga liabilities or assets natin or contra assets no accumulated depreciation. Okay, I hope that's clear. Pero naubusan ako ng space para sa charging ng overhead to production. Ano lang natin, when we charge overhead to production, how do we do that? So, maliliit na formulas yung mga ginawa ko dito. Pero na formula na entries rather, pero ito rin po yung mga entries na pinag-usapan natin. So, recall lang natin before we charge to overhead. Ayan. So before we charge overhead, purchase of raw materials, debit, raw materials, inventory, and credit accounts payable. Pero nag-return, kaya nilagyan ko ng red, debit accounts payable, debit manufacturing overhead. Para saan nga yung manufacturing overhead na to? Para po to sa freight in nung isinoli natin ang mga materials. Okay, next. Issue materials to production, debit work in process, and debit manufacturing overhead. Para saan yung working process? For the DM, MOH for the IM, and credit raw materials inventory. Okay? And then, pag nagsoli sa stockroom ng sobrang materials na na-issue, so debit WIP, ay baliktad. Mali po, buti na lang, nakita natin to. So debit, raw materials inventory, credit, work in process, and credit manufacturing overhead. Ayan, mali ako na nailagay. Okay? So, incur factory labor, debit, factory payroll, credit, the government payables, and credit also accrued payroll. Para saan nga yung accrued payroll? Ito yung net pay ng mga empleyado. Okay? And charge labor to production, anong debit uli natin? Work in process for the direct labor, manufacturing overhead for the indirect labor, credit to factory payroll. Nag-reclass lang tayo. Ano uli yung shortcut natin dito? We can debit agad yung work in process, debit manufacturing overhead, and credit. Itong dalawa na to. Okay? Pag kinumbine natin yung entries niya. And number 5, we incur the manufacturing overhead. We just simply use debit, manufacturing overhead, and credit various accounts. So alam na natin yung istorya ng various accounts na in-explain natin in the previous slide. At this point, we will charge overhead to production. Kapag actual costing system po tayo, i-highlight ko, actual costing system po tayo, yung costing system na yan, gusto lang yan i-emphasize on how we are going to charge overhead to production. Ibig sabihin lang, we charge the actual overhead to production. Saan natin makikita yung actual overhead? Number one, bibilugan ko po yung isa. May overhead po tayo sa pag-solid ng materials. May overhead po tayo dito sa issuance dito. May overhead po dito. Ayan. Saan pa may overhead? Ito pa isang overhead. Nasa overhead? Sa number 5. We have the, di ba, nandito yung T-root sa number 5. We have the IL sa number 4. We have the IM sa number 2. So in other words, we will just get the total amount of overhead na na-debit minus all the overhead na na-credit natin and charge to production. And debit, dahil charge to production, debit, work in process, i-charge mo. Ano i-charge mo? Yung overhead to production. Tingnan din po, what do you charge? Yun yung credit natin. Okay? Ayan. So debit, working process, and credit, manufacturing, overhead. So I hope that's clear. And let's just continue. Ayan. So pinaliit ko na. Pero syempre, mali pa rin po ito, ha? Okay, pardon me. So debit, raw materials, inventory, bumalik sa raw mats, and credit, working process, and credit also, manufacturing, overhead. Ayan. Kinorek ko ng sarili ko. Ayan, so going back, na-charge mo sa production lahat, nasa WIP na lahat, nasa working process na lahat, ano na lang hinihintay natin? Makumpleto yung ating products. So pag nakumpleto yung product natin, ibebenta natin later on. Teka lang. So yan. So pag nakumpleto yung product natin, anong entry natin? Debit, finished goods, inventory, and credit, work in process. Transfer lang natin yung work in process to finished goods. Pero sometimes, sasabihin sa exam, only 80% of total cost or of working process are completed. So, ibig sabihin, yung 80% lang yun nandito, yung 20% may iiwan pa rin siya sa work in process. Okay? Yung working process ending natin, meron pa siyang 20% because the 80% will now become your finished goods inventory. Kapag ganun yung sinabi. Okay? Pero kung natapos lahat, so debit finished goods inventory for all the amounts of your work in process. And credit, work in process. Saan ba manggagaling yung work in process mo? 1, overhead. 2, labor. 3, materials. Nakita po? Materials, labor, and overhead pa rin po yung inilipat mo sa finished goods if the process is completed. So once na magbebenta na tayo, once na completed na rather, ibebenta na po natin yung products natin. Pag nagbenta tayo, of course, ang entry natin dyan ay debit. Siyempre, tatanggalin mo na po yung finished goods inventory at ililipat mo na po siya sa cost of goods sold. Okay? And yun lang ba entry natin pag may sales tayo? Debit, accounts receivable or cash, and credit sales. So it depends if on account or for cash yung ating sales. But of course, most of the time, AR po. Pero syempre, it depends on the problem na ibibigay ng examiner. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So yan yung flow ng manufacturing cost natin. Pero sa sobrang haba ng pinag-usapan natin, sa istorya niyan, sa entries niyan, i-simplify natin yung flow of manufacturing cost in a diagram. So, we have here the 3, the DM, DL, and MOH. Ano ibig sabihin natin sa tatlo na to? These are our 3 cost elements. Ay, yung tatlo na yan, when we put into process, tinaw niyo po yung word, when we put into process, this will become the total manufacturing cost or the work in process. Okay? So, after the work in process, ano susunod? Magiging cost of goods manufactured. Matatapos na at magiging finished goods. Diba? Ang cost of goods manufactured, yung finished goods natin, eventually it will be sold. Kaya we now call it cost of goods sold. So mas madali siyang intindihin kapag ginawa natin siyang diagram. Gusto lang natin i-emphasize na yung DM dito ay yung direct materials used. Paano ba natin makukompute yung direct materials used? Remember, we have our purchases. Okay? Tapos, isama pa natin yung freight in natin. Net po yung purchases natin. Net of your purchase returns and purchase returns and allowances and purchase discount. Okay? Tapos, add natin yung freight in natin. Now, paano natin makukuha yung DM use? We add the DM beginning and then we deduct the DM ending. Okay? So that's the time that we can compute for the DM use. Sometimes, ang tawag natin dito sa mga ito, yung purchases natin plus freight in plus direct materials beginning, ano tawag natin dyan? These are your direct materials available for use. Kasi minsan sa exam yun yung tanong, direct materials available for use. So, lahat naman ng materials mo at the beginning, tapos bumili ka pa ng iba, lahat naman ng yun ay literally available for use. At ang intention natin dyan ay talagang gamitin. So, it's either nagamit or maiiwan sa inventory. Kaya nga, pag minus mo yung naiwan, you can compute for the DM na nagamit. Okay? How do we compute for the DL? Siyempre, mas detalyado pagdating sa accounting for labor na discussion natin, but sometimes this is just direct labor hours times the rate. Okay? So, ilang oras ba yung trinabaho times the rate? Manufacturing overhead, paano natin nakukuha to? TRUD. Kapag actual costing system. Pero kapag normal costing system ang gagamitin natin, actual versus normal, we are using the predetermined overhead rate. Yan. And then the rate will be multiplied with the level of activity that we have. Pero kung actual costing system, we will focus on the sum of the TRUD that we have. Okay? And then all of these, when charged to production, work in process na. Gusto lang natin i-emphasize na ang mga work in process na yan, possible na at the end of the period ay hindi lahat matatapos. Kaya meron tayong work in process na ending. And possible na nakaraang period, meron ding hindi natapos, kaya meron tayong work in process beginning. Okay? So work in process beginning na yan, idagdag mo pa lahat ng inad mo this period, itong TMC po ang TMC po, ito yung DM, DLOH added this period. Yung work in process beginning natin, ito yung DM, DLOH added in the prior period. Kaya nga, kung makikita mo, lahat ng cost na to ay added in the production. That's why when you combine the work in process beginning and total manufacturing cost, we call it total cost to account or total cost put into process. Literal naman po. Yun yung total cost naman talaga na inilagay natin sa process. And at the end of the period, pag may natira, kasi di ba nga in process, naghihintay ka na matapos or baka yung iba maiwan. Pag minus mo yung natira, that's the time that you can compute for your cost of goods manufactured. Ito po yung finished goods na madadagdag this period. Klaro natin, ang cost of goods manufactured ay yung finished goods na nadagdag this period. Kasi possible po may finished goods beginning, merong hindi ka nabenta dati. So, ang finished goods beginning na yan, at itong finished goods na yan, para saan ba yan? Ang intention natin ay ibenta. Kaya pag pinagsama mo ang finished goods beginning at lahat ng finished goods na natapos mo this period, we call it cost of goods available for sale. Since available for sale yan, dalawa lang ang patutunguhan, mabenta o hindi. Pag minus mo yung hindi nabenta, makukuha mo yung nabenta. Okay? So I hope nakuha nyo yung story ng flow of manufacturing cost because this time, we will come up with a statement of cost of goods manufactured and sold of ABC company. So this is the heading of the statement or the schedule. Na name of the company and then the statement or the name of the schedule and then yung period for the year ended December 31, 20XX. Okay. So remember the story that we started with purchases. Di ba? And then after that, beginning less ending. What do we get? Yung purchases net natin, syempre add din natin yung freight in natin kung hindi man siya na-mention. Okay. Yung freight in natin, hindi lang siya na-mention. Okay? So purchases plus DM beginning minus DM ending, what do we get? The DM use. And after that, di ba, when we purchase materials, ito na yung issue to production. What do we need? Yung number 3, yung labor. Yung number 4, yung overhead naman. Actually, number 5 na pala siya. Okay? So when we charge to production, yung labor and overhead, ayan na po siya. So what do we call yung sum ng tatlo? The total manufacturing cost. Okay. Ang total manufacturing cost, di ba lahat na yan ay put into process, kaya in process yan. Grupo ng mga in process. So, work in process beginning minus work in process ending, makikita mo yung flow. Plus beginning minus ending. Ano ang tawag natin doon? That would be your cost of goods manufactured. Ang cost of goods manufactured ay grupo ng mga finished goods. Ito yung manufactured finished goods this period. So plus finished goods beginning minus finished goods ending. We will come up with the cost of goods sold. Okay? So yan yung istorya na madali mo siyang mai-establish kasi mo yung flow of manufacturing costs. Hindi mo siya i-memorize. Tandaan mo yung flow. Bumili ako ng materials. Ginamit ko yung materials. I charge the labor, may overhead. Ang tawag ko ay total manufacturing cost. Lahat ng total manufacturing cost ay WIP. Grupo ng WIP. Plus WIP beginning minus WIP ending. Ang hinihintay na lang naman natin ng storya after ng mga in process ay ma-manufacture siya or ma-complete. So we call it cost of goods manufactured. And then, grupo ng mga finished goods plus finished goods beginning minus ending, we have the cost of goods sold. Okay? May mga presentation ng schedule of cost of goods manufactured na mas detalyado pa. So, i-breakdown lang natin yung iba. So, start ulit ng purchases. So, what do we have? DM beginning. So, pag in-add natin yung DM beginning, ano ulit tawag natin doon? Ang materials ay ginagamit natin. So, direct materials available for use. Ang patutunguhan, magamit o hindi. Pag hindi nagamit, DM beginning. Yung pag niles mo yan, DM use ang meron tayo. Okay? So, what else after the DM use? Labor and overhead na po ulit. Again, kung naka-actual costing system tayo, yung overhead natin dyan ay yung actual na manufacturing overhead. Okay, and then after that, total manufacturing cost po yung sum ng DM, DL, and OH. So, anong susunod? Work in process beginning. Diba? Sabi natin, lahat ng in process, yan yung mga nilalagay, yan yung mga cost na nilalagay natin in the process. That's why you call it total cost to account or total cost put into process. Minsan ito yung term, total cost put into process, TCPIP. Okay? And lahat ng total cost put into process, yung iba dyan, matatapos, yung iba, hindi. Minus yung hindi natapos, makukuha natin yung natapos. Okay? So again, cost of goods manufactured, meron ang cost of goods manufactured ay ibebenta na natin. Ito yung mga finished goods natin na nagawa this period. Sama natin yung mga finished goods before. Lahat ng yan, ang tawag natin ay cost of goods available for sale. Mahaba-haba kasi words. Kaya all gaps na lang nilagay ko. Cost of goods available for sale. I hope you can get along with the story. And then less. Diba? Available for sale. Ang intention na ibenta. Ang hindi mabenta, i-minus mo. Makukuha mo yung nabenta, which is your cost of goods sold. Okay? So that's the schedule of cost of goods manufactured and sold. Meron bang gustong mag-volunteer na i-recite yung schedule of cost of goods manufactured and sold? Pwede ba akong mag-request ng participant na pwedeng mag-recite? Tingnan ko nga. Kung sino makita ko Huwag magtsapi-tsapihan. Ayan, hindi ko kilala pero Catherine Miranda. Try lang. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Catherine. Ay, ano ba ako? Naka-mute ba ako? Hindi ba ako naririnig? Catherine? O baka nahihirapan si Catherine sa signal niya. Ayun. Is that you, Catherine?
Yes po. Medyo choppy po kasi.
Okay. Pero you were able to, clearly hear and see yung yung schedule of cost of goods manufactured and sold?
Doon po ako na-disconnect.
Okay. O sige. Isipin ko na sino gusto mong sumagot for you? Meron ka bang ituturong kaibigan na hindi mo siya magiging kaibigan ngayon?
Kung sino na lang po may gusto.
Wow, very safe. Sige nga, try natin si Miss Lazaro. Miss Lazaro, baka naman gusto mong itry. Miss Lazaro, hello? Okay, sabi ko nga, baka humaba yung oras natin, baka choppy or what, or I'll just go back to the previous slide. Okay, ayan. Gusto ko lang i-highlight yung mga possible questions in the exam. Okay, burahin lang natin ito. Okay. Pag tinanong sa exam, ang total manufacturing cost, dapat agad-agad na automatic sa isip natin na ito ay DM, DL, and OH. But sometimes, yung isa sa tatlo na yan, unknown. So, meron kang OH, may DL ka, pero hindi mo alam kung ano yung direct materials mo. Ito po yung tinatanong hindi mo alam yung DM mo. What you can do is you can go up sa ating formula. Baka meron ka nito, baka meron ka nito. So, kung meron ka niyan, you will be able to solve the DMUs. And you will be able to solve the total manufacturing cost. Okay? Paano? Dito po tayo sa kabila. Ang dami ko sinulat dyan. Tinatanong to. Meron ito, wala nito. Meron ito, wala nito. Wala nang paraan para ma-solve siya. So, ang gagawin mo, you can go down. Baka hindi sa taas makukuha yung solution. Ang solution could be, check mo, meron ba nito? Meron ba nito? Meron nito? Ito naman pala ang kumpleto. So to get the TMC, that would be your cost of goods manufactured plus WIP end minus WIP beginning, you can compute for your TMC. Okay? Kaya kung kabisado mo itong schedule of cost of goods manufactured, kahit anong itanong sa'yo na nasa gitna nito, basta try mo sa taas muna, try mo sa baba, tingnan mo kung saan mo siya possible na ma-solve. Okay? Nagkataon, wala pala nito. Control P. Wala nito. Lahat na to, wala na yan. Hindi natin masasolve. Wala pa nitong cost of goods manufactured. You can go down pa. Meron ba nito? Meron ba nito? Meron naman pala nung tatlo. So this time, you can compute for the cost of goods manufactured. And you can now compute for the TMC. Okay? So, hanapan mo na paraan kung paano siya mako-compute, pero definitely nandyan lang yon sa schedule of cost of goods manufactured and sold. Lahat halos ng problems na nandun sa chapter 1 natin dito umiikot. Kung kabisado mo siya, madali mo siyang masasagutan. Kaso, nalaman mo, Control P, wala rin ito. Hindi mo siya masolve sa taas, hindi mo siya masolve sa baba. Anong gagawin mo? Baka naman yung cost of goods sold, magawan mo ng paraan. Remember, pag may markup, tapos may sales, makukuha mo si cost of goods sold. Remember? Kaya pag nakuha mo na si cost of goods sold, you can now solve for cost of goods manufactured and eventually for total manufacturing cost. Ibig sabihin lang, definitely may solution po yan. But sometimes the examiner will not give you question na one step lang. May mga multiple steps that you have to perform before you can come up with the answer. Another, Another possible scenario, tinatanong kasi to, wala ka nang mapala sa taas, wala ka na rin mapala sa baba, wala na rin sales and all. Okay? Meron ka nitong DMUs, wala ka nito, meron ka nito, DL pala ang problema mo. Baka naman binigay sa iyo yung conversion cost. So in that way, ima-minus mo lang sa MOH, you can get your direct labor. So yung question mark, naka-check na, you can now compute for the TMC. Okay? Sir, walang conversion cost. Anong meron ka? Prime cost. Can you still solve? Yes, prime cost, remember, your DM and your DL. There's always a way. So in that case, masasolve mo na si DL and you can compute yung TMC natin. Or simply the prime cost plus your MOH. Okay, so paikot-ikot lang po itong nasa schedule of cost of goods manufactured and sold. Another scenario. Erase ko lang yung mga nakasulat. Ayan. Let us say, for example, that your purchases is 100,000. Tapos ang binigay, instead na DM and DM beginning and DM less. So sabihin niya, increase in the DM is 20,000. Decrease in WIP is 30,000. Increase in finished goods, ay kulang ng 0 yung 30,000 pa. Increase in finished goods, 40,000. Ngayon, how are we going to solve for the cost of goods sold? So, syempre, lagyan natin si DL na yung conversion cost na 200,000. Yan. So, how are we going to solve? Pababa. Increase ng 20,000. Pwede mong isipin na kung increase yan from 0, naging 20,000. Kaya, ang gagawin mo, 100 plus 0 minus 20. So, that would be minus 20,000. So, that would be 80,000 na direct materials used. Okay? Kung increase pala ng DM and you are solving downwards, kabaligtaran yung sign natin. Ang increase is a minus pag nagko-compute tayo pababa. So, plus 200,000 na conversion cost. Ang TMC natin ay 280,000. Okay? Sabi sa sumunod, decrease in work in process. So isipin natin, bumaba. So baliktarin mo, 30,000 ka ng beginning, naging 0 na. Bumaba. You can assign 0 dun sa either, depende sa situation. So plus 30,000 minus 0, so that would give you 310,000 na cost of goods manufactured. Okay? Sabi sa sumunod, increase in finished goods na 40,000. So in this case, 0 yung beginning, 40,000. Pero hindi ko po sinasabi na totoong 0 yung beginning or totoong 0 yung ending. I am just assigning pag nalilito pa ako mag-solve. So minus yung 40,000, so that would give you 270,000 na cost of goods sold. Kaya minsan kasi sa exam, diretso po yan. 100,000, bibigyan ka nito, tapos puro mga increase-decrease lang ang ibibigay sa'yo. But if you will notice, tulad sabi ko kanina, pag increase, naka-minus. Pag decrease, naka-plus. Naka-minus. Okay? If you are solving downwards, baka mamaya paakyat yung solve mo, syempre baligtad na po yung convention. If you are solving from cost of goods sold, paakyat sa purchases, yung increase, naka-plus na talaga. So 270 plus 40 is 310. Yung decrease, naka-minus na talaga. 310 minus 30 is 280. So, syempre, minus 200, we have 80. Tapos, yung increase dito ng direct materials, pagpapunta sa purchases, naka-plus na talaga siya, kaya 100,000. Okay? So, kung ang natandaan mo, mas komportable ka or mas madali sa'yo na mag-solve, na kapag increase, kabaliktaran, solving downwards, pero kapag solving upwards, susundin mo yung convention niya. So yun ang gamitin mo. Pero kung mas madali sa'yo na mag-assign ng 0 dun sa isa sa beginning or ending, depende sa situation, that's the time na yun ang gamitin mo. Kung alin yung mas convenient para sa inyo. Okay? So I'll just check. May question po tayo. Ayan. Sir, I was okay. Sorry. Okay, personal palang message. It's okay. So I hope you were able to get the strategies on how you're going to answer yung mga problems natin sa chapter 1. Okay? So, babalikan nyo ngayon yung mga nasa libro ninyo. I'll give you the answers later on, pero we will discuss yung mga ibang problems nun. But of course, after I discuss yung mga problems na isasend ko sa inyo. Okay, any questions so far? Any questions so far before we have a break?
Mukhang wala naman.
Oh, wala naman. So I think let's end muna yung recording, tas we will just have a break, tapos mag-start ulit tayo ng recording. Somebody confirm?
Yes, sir.
Ayan. So questions, no? Okay, you can now start recording again. Questions. There are questions habang naka-break tayo na pumasok kasi medyo delayed talaga yung sometimes yung lecture. So here are the questions. So ayaw magpakita. Ayan. Sir, paano po, hindi ko sasabihin ko kanino galing ha. So sir, paano po, for example, pag sinabi FGI increased by 186,000, talagang may amount ha. Tapos meron na pong cost of goods manufactured. Nasaan ba yun? Cost of goods manufactured. Meron na pong cost of goods manufactured. Sabihin na natin 300,000, dagdagan na natin yung given mo. Okay? Tapos FGI increased by 186,000. Actually, ang tanong ko rin, ano ba yung tanong mo? Baka cost of goods sold. Okay, cost of goods sold. Ayan. So, increased by 186,000. So, ano po ang sagot natin dito? Plus or minus. Diba? Increased by is either plus 0 minus 186,000. Parang ganun. Or, alam naman natin, if you are solving downwards, yung increase would be a minus. So that would be, magkano? 114,000. Tama ba yung math natin? Ayan. The cost of goods sold is 114,000. Yung question dito, wala pong beginning balance ng finished goods inventory. It doesn't matter kung wala. Basta, klaro naman na sa atin na increased by 186,000. Pwede naman na ang beginning ay 1,000, tapos ang ending ay 187,000. The answer will be the same, na naka-minus 186,000 tayo. So, enough na sa atin yung phrase na increased by. Okay, so baka may follow-up question yung nagtanong kanina. Opo, COGS. Yes, tama naman daw na COGS po yung hinahanap. Okay, so wag nyo nang pag meron na kayong increase by finished goods, huwag na kayong maghanap ng iba. Enough na yan to solve for your COGS. Okay? So let's go to the next question. Sir, tanong ko lang po, kapag inad po yung conversion cost and prime cost, equals manufacturing cost ba yun? Parang hindi, no? Sobra may naulit. Kasi di ba po, ayan pala, nag-lecture na siya, very good. Ang prime cost daw ay DM at saka DL. And then, ang conversion cost ay DL at saka OH. Tama naman po yan. Kaya pag inad mo yung PC plus conversion cost, prime cost at conversion cost, hindi po total manufacturing cost ang lalabas. Sobra-sobra po yan dahil nakadoble si direct labor. Kaya yung DM, DL, OH ay total manufacturing cost. Ang pwedeng mangyari, prime cost at saka overhead. O kaya, direct materials at saka conversion cost. Yan po ang TMC pa rin. Okay? So I hope nasagot natin yung tanong ng isa nating classmate. Huwag po kayo mayang magtanong. Kung naiya po kayo magtanong to everyone, pwede po kayo mag-send privately ng question para mapag-usapan po natin. Okay? Ayan. So, alam nyo, personally, when I solve problems, I always try to understand lahat ng concepts muna. Kasi ang hirap po na diretso ako ng problem, tapos parang minememorize ko kung paano siya sinosolve. Mas importante na malalim yung magiging foundation nyo sa theories. Kasi mula dun sa theories na yun, dun mo actually ma-establish yung mga formula. At ang formula naman sa cost accounting, wala namang masyado, aside from the schedule of cost of goods manufactured and sold, na dun iikot halos yung tanong natin. Okay, so let me check kung meron pang tanong. So far, wala. So I think this time, we can now proceed with our topic. Okay, so it's job order costing. Actually, yung chapter 1, introduction. Yung chapters 2 to 6, ito yung job order costing system. Yung 2, 3, and 4, accounting for materials, accounting for labor. Chapter 4 is accounting for overhead. Chapter 5 is ABC, pero overhead pa rin ang focus nun. Tapos chapter 6, yung job order costing system. Ito na po yun. Pero tulad ng sabi ko, we include that in the introduction in the discussion of chapter 1. Because we have to be familiar, especially with the documents that we are using sa job order costing system. So managers, they really need to assign costs to products to facilitate yung external financial reporting and internal decision making. So this time, we're going to illustrate yung absorption costing approach to calculate the product cost known as the job order costing system. So ang objective muna natin this time is to distinguish between the process costing system and job order costing system. And we are going to identify some companies that would use each costing method. And so we have here, the process costing system is actually best used by companies that produce many units of a single products. Nakikita nyo na yung characteristics ng process costing system. And when one unit of output is indistinguishable or actually homogeneous po yung ginagamit na term sa ibang libro. So one unit of product is indistinguishable from the other units of product. Sabi dito, identical in nature of each unit of product enables assigning the same average cost per unit. So mas madaling mag-assign ng average cost per unit kasi isa nga lang yung product natin. Okay, so an example of company, ito yung isang paper manufacturing company. Hindi ako sigurado on how we pronounce this correctly, pero ito ay isang paper manufacturing company. So when we think of paper manufacturing, we generally think about continuous production of a single roll ng paper that may be eventually be cut into sizes. Depende sa kailangan ng mga customers. Diba? We have different sizes of papers, bond paper, mga papers that we are using. Okay? But pag nag-process itong paper manufacturer na to, dire-diretso lang din siya. Later on pa natin, dire-diretso lang siya, then later on iisipin natin ikakat lang siya into the desired sizes of the customers. And then other companies that would benefit the process costing, itong Reynolds Aluminum, yung refining, and of course Coca-Cola, malamang kilala natin lahat to. Certainly the desire of all three of these companies is to make each unit of output consistent with the quality standards established. So Coca-Cola bottled, for example, sa ibang bansa, sa California, should taste identical to the same product bottled in New York City, in Philippines, so dapat pare-parehas po yun kahit saan gawin. Okay? So, sa job order costing system naman, a company would use this costing system when many different products are produced each period. So yun yung difference niya. Kanina, ano sabi natin kanina kay process costing, many units of a single product. Kay job order, many different products are produced each period. Okay? These products are usually manufactured to customers' specification and are unique in nature. So ito, unique yung nature niya kasi kaya nga job order, kung ano yung gusto ng customer, baliktad sa process costing, gawa tayo ng gawa and then later on, ibebenta natin sa customer. Same lang yung mga products na yan, no? May job order costing system, ginagawa natin pag meron tayong order. Di kaya may specification ng customer. Okay, so products are manufactured to order. Okay, so the unique nature of each order requires tracing or allocating costs to each job. So di ba nga, per order yon depende sa specification ng customer. So that would require tracing. Alamin mo kung ano nga uli yung tracing natin, ginagamit natin para sa pag-assign ng mga direct costs. Allocating ay ginagamit, yung term na yan ay ginagamit natin sa pag-assign ng mga indirect costs. And maintain cost records for each job. Okay, so examples of companies that are using job order costing system. Itong aircraft manufacturer, itong construction ng large scale construction. So itong Bechtel na to is actually the largest international construction company. So the company works on huge projects that are unique to customer needs. At ang Walt Disney, of course, movie production. So syempre, depende sa kung anong movie ginagawa, you accumulate cost dun sa movie na ginagawa na yon. Okay? So we have here yung summary ng comparison ng process and job order costing system. So this table just shows to us an overview on the differences between sa job order nga at saka sa process. So with job order, many jobs are worked during the period, pero with process costing system, single product is produced for a long period of time. With job order, accumulated by individual job, per job ang pag-accumulate, pero sa process costing, per department ang pag-accumulate natin. Ang process costing po ay pag-uusapan natin after the midterm. Ito pong job order, ang focus natin ngayong midterm. Okay? So average cost computed by job din kapag job order, by department naman pag process costing system. Okay. So at this point, we are going to identify the documents in a job order costing system. So in a job order costing system, direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead, ito po ay ina-assign sa mga jobs. Pero yung direct materials and direct labor are traced directly to each job as the work is performed. Okay? So, manufacturing overhead naman, so that includes yung indirect materials, indirect labor, and all other overhead that you would remember to all jobs rather than directly traced to each job. Ulitin natin, ito pong direct materials, directly traceable kay job number 1, job number 2, and job number 3. Ganun din si direct labor. Pero pag si overhead, although same arrow pala yung naipakita, ibig sabihin lang natin, itinototal natin yung overhead and then later on kapag actual costing system, we just distribute to jobs number 1, 2, and 3 at kung ilang mang jobs ang meron tayo. Okay? So, yan. This is just an example of the job cost sheet. Ano ba yung job cost sheet? This is used by the accounting department para matrack nila yung direct and indirect costs associated with a given job. So a job number is uniquely identified kada job. So for this one, yung order ng customer ay inassign natin sa job A, 1, 4, 3. Okay? So, a job number, di ba, sabi natin, we uniquely identify it to a customer. So, direct materials, direct labor, and overhead are accumulated for each of the job. Okay? And then, the job cost sheet, it serves as the subsidiary ledger to the work in process. Kasi lahat ng DM, DL, and OH na charge mo to production, kinocompute natin per job. So kung maraming jobs po yan, so maraming DM, DL, OH po yan, lahat po yan, remember, whenever you charge to production, the DM, DL, and OH, you actually debit to work in process and credit whatever it is that you are charging. So nagsisilbing subsidiary ledger si job cost sheet kay work in process account. So we will look at the job cost sheet used by this company, si Perco job cost sheet. So Perco company. So the company job that calls for the construction of wooden cargo crate. Ayan, so yan yung product nila. And you can see the separate sections for DM, DL, and OH. So kung ang customer mo ay 10, na lahat na to ay ginagawa mo ngayon, 10 job cost sheet ang meron tayo at 10 unique na job number ang i-assign natin sa kanila. And whenever gumagastos tayo ng materials, labor, and overhead, check natin anong job ba ang pupuntahan nito, doon natin i-record sa job cost sheet na yan. But at the end of the day, lahat na nire-record natin doon will be accumulated in the work in process account. Okay, so let's continue. For example, measuring direct materials cost. Paano ba natin nire-record? Balik lang tayo dito. Saan natin hinuhugot yung data ng direct materials dito sa job cost sheet? Ang panggagalingan po natin ng materials niyan ay materials requisition form. Okay, so once a sales order has been received kasi and a production order issued, ang production department will prepare materials requisition form to specify ano ba yung type, quantity, and total cost of materials. Ito yung mga quantity, yung materials that we need, ang ilan, and unit cost. And then we will come up with the total cost. Nakalagay po dito, job A143. So yung materials requisition form is intended for job A143. Meron din pong monitoring, nakaseries din po ang requisition number para may tracing tayo na ito ay yung requisition number natin na chargeable to job number or customer A143. Okay? So, eto po, pag nilipat mo sa job cost sheet this time, so once the materials have been issued ng storeroom, they are charged to the job cost sheet for a job number A143. So, check natin, nandito sa job A143. The accounting department records the total direct cost of 116. Tapos requisition number, yan po para pag trace natin saan siyang MRF or materials requisition form nang galing. Okay, so parang nilipat lang natin dito. And automatically, that would be summarized dito sa ilalim, yung direct materials na ginamit natin to produce the wooden cargo crate kay job A143. Okay, so let's continue. Paano naman yung ilalagay natin sa labor? So what we are using is ang time ticket ay iba sa time card. Pero for this discussion, we will be focusing on the time ticket. When we go to accounting for labor, doon tayo magiging mas detalyado ano ba ang difference ng time card sa time ticket. Tapos tuturuan natin kayo na mag-payroll so you can compute for the net pay that you can take home kapag nagtrabaho na kayo, nagganto ang sweldo nyo given the updated na SSS, PhilHealth, Pag-ibig, and withholding taxes na mga obligations ng mga empleyado. Okay? So going back here, sa direct labor, ang reference natin ay time ticket. So in this time ticket, workers are using this to record the amount of time that they spent on each job. Nasan yung job ayon? Job number A143 din siya naka-assign. So pinakita dito, time from 8 to 4, so 8 hours ang trinabaho niya, ano yung rate niya? 88. Saan naka-assign? A143. Kaya pupunta ka ngayon, babalik ka sa job cost sheet, yung si employee IM still, pupunta ka sa job cost sheet para i-record mo naman yung direct labor niya. So ticket 36, I'll go back. Ticket number 36, meron din po tayong monitoring. So ticket number 36, babalik tayo dito. Number 36, ilang oras, magkano yung charge. That is the amount of labor charged to job A143. So masasummarize ulit siya sa ilalim. I'll check. Okay. Sir, yung materials requisition form po ba, kasama na rin po yung mga indirect materials kapag po merong i-request o may iba pong form? Ayan, that's a very good question. Since direct materials yung focus natin, dito sa naunang items, materials requisition form na request natin ay puro mga direct materials lang. Pero you are correct na materials requisition form din ang pwede mong gamitin pagdating sa indirect materials. However, hindi po siya i-record dito sa job cost sheet. Kasi yung materials requisition form is intended for materials talaga, whether ito ay direct or indirect. Pero saan pupunta yung indirect materials? Dito po yun sa overhead. Okay? Now, what we do here is, yung tirod natin, ina-add po natin yan lahat. Yung total na overhead natin, total overhead. Kung ang ating costing system ang ginagamit natin ay actual costing system, yung total overhead na yan, yung total tirod na yan would be divided by the number of, would be distributed sa lahat ng jobs na meron tayo. Now, the company has the option to also make use of the normal costing system, wherein we make use of the predetermined overhead rate. Halimbawa, may overhead rate tayo ng 8 pesos per direct labor hours. Ilang direct labor hours ba yung trinabaho natin for this particular job? 10 hours pala. So 80 ang ilalagay natin sa overhead. So it really depends on the company if they are using actual or normal costing system. But generally, the companies are using normal costing system, or some of the companies are using standard costing system. So we will go there later on pag nasa after na ng midterm. Okay? So yan. So I hope I was able to answer yung question kanina. Ginagamit bang MRF for indirect materials? The answer is yes, but it will not be part of the direct materials reported in the job cost sheet. Kasama siya sa total na tirod natin na i-allocate natin sa ating mga jobs kung actual costing system po tayo. Okay? Ayan. So where are we now? So this time, ayan, actually, nauna lang yung question, pero ito po yung time that we are going to compute for the predetermined overhead rates, and we are going to explain also why estimated overhead costs are used in the costing process instead ng actual overhead. Or in other words, bakit magno-normal costing system halip na actual costing system? Makikita natin yung advantages if we make use of the normal costing system. Ano rin naman yung disadvantage kapag nag-normal costing system tayo. Okay. So, manufacturing overhead is applied to all jobs that are in process, di ba? So, we apply overhead using a base which we believe na that would cause the overhead cost to be incurred. Remember yung cost driver? We already defined that in our previous meetings. So yun. So some companies would allocate yung manufacturing overhead using direct labor hours, so iba naman machine hours. Depende po kung ano talaga yung cost driver natin. It depends on the nature of the business. It depends on the nature or the type of the product. It depends on your operation. Kung machine dependent yan, machine hours. Pwede. Kung labor intensive yung products natin, it could be direct labor. Okay? So we must allocate overhead costs to jobs for a variety of reasons. Bakit tayo magno-normal costing system? First, it is difficult. Kung hindi man siya imposible, mahirap siya to actually trace overhead costs of particular job. Diba, the cost of grease of a machinery, yung oil na ginagamit natin sa machinery to manufacture our product, part din sa manufacturing cost as overhead. It would be impossible to accurately trace yung amount of that oil or grease consumed to manufacture 1 unit of output. Okay? Kaya ang ginagawa natin, we are trying to simplify. So manufacturing overhead also includes a number of different costs, yung tirod natin, and it would be very difficult to gather all of them together in time so that we can charge them to a particular job. So a job may be complete, pwedeng nabenta na rin siya before we can determine the actual overhead. In other words, yung actual na tirod natin, ang tagal bago ma-determine. Nabenta na natin, natapos na yung product, tsaka pa lang natin makukuha yung talagang total niyan. Okay? So finally, maraming types of overhead are fixed in nature. So even though output fluctuates during the period, so like the taxes, like the insurance, yung rent, Di ba halos fixed in nature yung mga yan? Okay? The depreciation. Di ba? So, to facilitate naman yung pag-allocate natin ng overhead to each job, we calculate what we call the predetermined overhead rate. Ito po, the predetermined overhead rate. So, how do we calculate the predetermined overhead rate? So the rate is calculated by dividing the estimated manufacturing overhead, ito po, for the coming period. And we also estimate the total number of units in the allocation base for the coming period. So that's the time that we can compute for the predetermined overhead rate. So ideally, the allocation base is a cost driver that causes the overhead. Yung sinabi natin kanina. So, magkano kaya ang mai-incur natin ng manufacturing overhead? Estimate lang. Halimbawa, kung yan ay nakadepende sa machine hours, gaano karaming machine hours kaya ang magagamit natin for the entire coming period. Ayun, and then we divide that. Estimate lang po ito we divide that, and then we come up with a predetermined overhead rate. But then again, yung estimate natin, hindi naman po, walang assurance na yung actual natin would be the same. Ang disadvantage ng normal costing system ay magkakaroon tayo ng variance. Sa actual costing system, hintayin mo na ma-incur mo lahat yan. Pag tinotal mo yan, i-divide mo sa lahat ng units na na-produce, mas accurate po yun. Ito, in-estimate mo lang. I-divide mo with the number of units produced, mayroon tayong variance. Estimated compared to actual, may variance po tayo. However, itong estimate po natin using the predetermined overhead rate, mas mabilis natin ma-determine yung cost. Kaya naman, dapat din yung estimate natin, kaya nga, for the longest time, ganito yung operations natin, that's the time that we can strongly estimate or parang close to reality yung ating estimate. Okay? Mahirap mag-estimate nang wala ka pang experience, parang kaka-open mo lang ng business, so mag-estimate ka agad. Pero na lang kapag meron kang ibang company na mapagkukomparean na ganito ang kanilang overhead rate, but then again, iba yung company nila established na with yours, hindi pa. Kaya ibang mga company pag simula pa lang, they would rather use the actual costing system or mag-estimate sila na medyo suntok sa buwan, hindi mo alam kung talagang malapit sa katotohanan, so you can expect na ang variance talaga ay pagkalaki-laki. Ayan. So, let's continue. Ito, nasabi ko na pala, meron nga pala akong slide for that. Why is there a need for the predetermined overhead rate? So, sabi natin, di ba nga, predetermined, we rely on the estimated data because yung actual overhead costs are not known until the end of the period. Yung TROD natin, at the end of the period, hindi pa natin alam kung magkano talaga yung total TROD natin. Pero kapag naka-normal costing system tayo at the end of the period, mako-compute na natin, ma-estimate na natin yung overhead natin that we could assign to the product. Okay? And also, yung actual overhead costs can fluctuate seasonally. Kaya minsan, misleading din yung decision makers. Okay? So, let's continue. How do we determine the predetermined overhead rates? So, predetermined overhead rates are calculated using this three-step process. So, ito yung sinabi natin kanina. Number one, you estimate the level of production for the period. Okay? So, normally, ang nag-estimate niyan, yun talaga involved in the production. Hindi siya basta-basta na-establish because you need to have the experience, you have to be reliable also yung estimate mo na medyo magiging malapit sa katotohanan. And then number two, estimate total amount of the allocation base for the period. And number three, simply divide. Estimate total manufacturing overhead costs. Tapos, to get the POHR or predetermined overhead rate, yung number 3, i-divide mo ng number 2. Actually, that's the formula in the previous slide. Okay? So, based on the estimates and determined before the period begins. So kaya predetermined. And actual amount of allocation is based upon the actual level of the activity. So ulitin natin, ang overhead applied is overhead rate times actual activity. Yung actual activity po is based on the level during the period of execution or during the accounting period na dun mo siya in-estimate talaga. Para dun mo in-estimate yung predetermined overhead mo. Okay, so overhead application, let's just apply. Let us assume na $640,000 ang ating estimated total overhead for the coming period. And we estimate also na 160,000 direct labor hours ang magagamit natin in the coming period. Estimate lang naman. So it also shows na DLH ang ating cost driver, maybe because the product, yung nature ng ating production ay labor intensive. So ang ating predetermined overhead rate ay 4 per direct labor hours. Okay, so please remember that. So for each direct labor hour work on a particular job, $4 of factory overhead will be applied to that job. So ito po yun. Pag dinala mo lang sa job cost sheet, di ba may 8 hours tayo? Di ba direct labor hours ang basis natin? So ito po yun. So ito rin po yun sa overhead. Anong rate ang na-compute natin? Yung predetermined overhead rate, yung POHR po natin. The product would be your overhead. And that would be added here sa ilalim. Okay. And after that, kung tapos na, kung wala na tayong gagawin kay job A143, tapos na siya, we will get the total cost of your product. Eh ilan po ba yung ginawa natin? Nakalagay po sa job cost sheet natin yung units completed, 2 po. Kaya ang unit production cost is 236 divided by 2. Kaya 118 per unit. So dito na nakadepende later on, ano bang markup mo? Para malaman mo, tinatanong kasi sa exam, up to the selling price per unit. If the markup is 50%, magkano po ang ating selling price? Sige nga, patingin nga sa chat box, if the markup is 50%, magkano ang ating selling price per unit? Can anybody put that in our chat box? Kung magkano selling price per unit? Ayan, may nakita na ako naglagay. 177, 177, is that correct? Check po natin. Sabi ko, if the markup is 50%, if the problem is silent, ano uli ang basis natin? Sales. Ibig sabihin, if the markup is 50%, the other half is your cost. So your cost is 118. Instead of multiplying by 1.5, i-divide po ito ng 50%. So ano po ang sagot natin? 236 po ang selling price natin. Huwag po malito. Sabi natin, markup is 50%. Silent ako. Sales ang basis. Pero pag sinabi natin, markup on cost is 50%. Yun na po yung sinasabi nyo na 118 times 1.5. So, yun po yung answer natin ay 177. Okay? So, 118 plus, ano 0.5 nito? 59. Tama, so 177. So, wag po malito doon ang haba-haba ng solution mo, tapos tinanong ay selling price per unit, tapos markup is 50%. Ang ginamit mo 1.5. You have to wait na sabihin ng examiner na markup on cost. Nandun yung word na on cost. Bago mo siya i-treat na 1 plus 50% or times 1.5. If the basis is sales, ibig sabihin, the markup is 50, the cost is 50. So the sales is 100%. And to get to 100%, divide the known data by its percentage, which is 50% also. So 236 ang ating selling price per unit. Okay, so I hope klaro na tayo dun sa part na yan. I'll just check if you have clarification. Ayan. So lahat po kayo nahuli halos. It's not 177, but it's 236. So be careful with that. Okay, so this time, understand the flow of cost, the job order costing system, and appropriate journal entries to record costs. Actually, ginawa na natin to kanina. Pero this time, naka-normal costing system kasi tayo. And you will see na halos parehas pala lahat ng entries at makikita nyo rin saan lang tayo nagkaiba. Okay, so I'll proceed. So document flow summary. So a sales order is the basis of issuing a production order. Diba sabi natin, ang job order costing system, production made to order po tayo. So kung walang sales order, walang production order. So dapat talaga may sales order muna before we can initiate a work on a job. Okay? And then from the production order, we are able to determine the direct and indirect materials that we will need to requisition from the storeroom. Diba? Yun yung may nagtanong kanina, yung MRF. Ayan. So, we now know that the materials requisition form, diba, is the critical source document. Minsan kasi ang tanong sa exam, yung mga documents sa theories. So, importante na kilala natin kahit paano, kahit hindi in actual, kahit dito yung mga picture lang natin sa examples natin, yun po yung documents that we are using. Okay? So, direct material costs are charged to specific jobs. So, mapupunta po siya sa job cost sheet. Ito po yung diniscuss natin kanina. Kasi indirect materials, sasama sa mga manufacturing overhead. Ayan. And then, as employees work on the job ordered, job covered by the production order, yung time tickets naman are prepared for recording both direct and indirect labor costs. But then again, kung makikita nyo yung document flow summary, yung direct labor pupunta sa job cost sheet, yung indirect labor sasama sa total ng PROD natin sa manufacturing overhead. I hope na i-imagine nyo na siya tuwing kailan ba ako naglalagay sa job cost sheet. Pag may direct materials, pag may direct labor, at kapag may overhead na tayo na i-apply sa job. Okay? So let's continue. Ito na po yun. Yung overhead na sinasabi natin na i-apply sa job. Now, whether actual costing system or normal costing system, ito total pa rin. Kung actual po tayo, ito total pa rin natin yung manufacturing overhead, and we are going to determine the predetermined overhead rate used to apply the overhead. Okay? Kapag actual po, the actual overhead rate na po yun, hindi na po siya predetermined. Pag normal costing system kasi, since that is our focus moving forward dito sa part na to, predetermined overhead rate na yung term natin. So, that's the time that we will now record yung manufacturing overhead component dun sa job cost sheet. Okay? Ayan. So, this time, we will now understand ulit the flow of costs in the job order costing system, and we are going to prepare the journal entries again. Pero, naka-normal tayo. Ibig sabihin na, ang clue mo kung normal costing system ang ginagamit sa exam ay yung predetermined overhead rate. Kasi yun yung distinction nung dalawa. The actual costing system, based on actual talaga from the term itself, the DM, DL, and OH actual yung tatlo. Pero pag normal costing system, DM, DL actual, pero yung OH gumagamit ng predetermined overhead rate. O, parang review na rin natin ang entries dito. So, raw materials purchases are recorded in an inventory account. So when we purchase raw mats, so debit raw materials inventory and credit accounts payable. Okay, so when we issue to a job, so debit work in process. Bakit may work in process? Para sa direct materials. Debit ulit kay manufacturing overhead para sa indirect materials, and credit raw materials inventory. Okay. Next, ito I'll be quick on this part kasi nakuha na natin to kanina sa earlier part of our discussion. Although for normal costing system siya, same lang lahat ng pinag-uusapan natin. Recording of labor costs. Kung makikita nyo po rito, debit work in process, hindi na po tayo dumaan sa factory payroll. Kasi diretso na po si accountant na i-record yung factory payroll diretso sa work in process, and debit ulit manufacturing overhead. This one is for DL, and this one is for indirect labor. and credit salaries and wages payable. That is alternative para kay accrued na payroll. Pwede rin naman po. Okay? Ayan. So pinagsama niya yung entries natin kanina sa earlier discussion. At this point, we're going to record the actual manufacturing overhead. Di ba talaga naman i-incur natin yung PRUD? Ayan, so debit, manufacturing overhead, credit, accounts payable, kung hindi pa bayad yung mga overhead natin, so property taxes payable, prepaid insurance, accumulated depreciation. Anong mapapansin mo sa mga entries natin? Diretso na po uli si cost accountant na nirecord to. Wala ng separate entry na, for example, debit depreciation expense and credit accumulated depreciation. Tapos i-request mo na debit manufacturing overhead and credit depreciation expense. Wala nang ganon. Dumiretso na po tayo sa debit manufacturing overhead and credit the accumulated depreciation. Hindi po siya mali. Dumiretso lang talaga. Okay? So, kaya wag po kayong magtataka bakit iba yung credit kapag nag-i-incur ng actual manufacturing overhead. Now, we are going to apply. Di ba sa steps natin sa flow of manufacturing costs? 1 is purchase materials, 2 we issue, 3 we incur the labor, 4 we charge the labor to production, 5 we incur the manufacturing overhead, and 6 we charge or we apply the overhead. Dito po kaya ako nag-stop kasi we are using the normal costing system and we will be using the predetermined overhead rate. Now, how to charge? Hindi po iba ang entries natin. Debit, work in process, and credit manufacturing overhead, parehas lang po. Ang only difference, possible na yung overhead na credit mo ay hindi equal sa lahat ng manufacturing overhead na naka-debit. Ang credit na manufacturing overhead natin, pag naka-credit, yan po yung applied. Pag naka-debit, ito po yung mga actual na overhead natin. Okay? Ayan. So, diretso tayo. Ito singit lang. Hindi po siya part ng manufacturing cost. But how do we account for non-manufacturing costs? Kasi usapang sweldo o salaries. Non-manufacturing costs are assigned to individual jobs. Are not assigned to individual jobs. Rather, they are expense. Di ba nga, period cost po yan? So expense when incurred. So examples are salary expense of employees who work in marketing, selling, or administrative capacity. Yung iba pa, advertising expenses are expense in the period incurred. So, ang entry po natin, halimbawa, payroll ang ginamit. Tapos ang payroll natin, meron tayo para sa factory, meron din tayo para sa operating expense natin. So ang entry natin is just a simple debit salaries expense. Yung usual natin na salaries expense and credit, salaries payable. Kasi nga in-expense natin immediately. And debit advertising expense and credit accounts payable. Yan po yung entry natin for non-manufacturing costs. They are charged to expense as they are incurred. Okay, so going back, transferring completed units. As jobs are completed, the cost of goods manufactured is transferred to finished goods from work in process. So debit finished goods and credit work in process. And as you can see, walang pagbabago sa entries natin as compared do sa mga nauna natin kanina sa actual costing system. Parehas na parehas. Paano pag nagbenta? Baka dito may iba na. Wala naman. When we sell our goods, debit accounts receivable and credit sales. And debit cost of goods sold and credit finished goods para itanggalin lang sa inventory yung ating finished goods kasi nabenta na po natin. Okay? So dalawang entries natin kapag nagbenta ng finished goods. Bakit dalawa? Kasi we are under the perpetual inventory system wherein we really take into account lahat ng in and out ng inventory. We debit kapag na-increase, we credit pag nag-decrease. Okay? So, sabi natin, kung parehas lang pala ng entries, paano sila nagkaiba? Remember, yung kapag actual costing system, yung actual mismo na overhead ang i-charge. So equal na yung mga MOH na debits, di ba MOH debits for all the actual MOH, MOH credit, para saan ang MOH credit? Para po sa applied. If we apply the actual, itong dalawa na to ay equal na automatically. Pero kapag gumamit tayo ng normal costing system, MOH debits, parehas po silang dalawa, MOH na debits na yan, yung tinutukoy niyan. Pero yung MOH credit natin for the applied, hindi na po sila parehas. Okay? Hindi na po sila parehas. Unequal po sila. Magkakaroon po tayo ng either over or under applied overhead. Okay? Over-applied. Nasobrahan ka na apply, nasobrahan ka na, alin ba yung applied sa dalawa? Debit or credit? Credit. So nasobrahan ka ng credit. So what do? Everything has to be adjusted back to actual. Pero, yung sabi ko kanina, yung actual kasi sometimes it takes long period bago mo makumpleto yung tirod natin. Okay? So yun lang yung disadvantage ng normal costing system kasi nga actual cannot be napakadalang na maging equal talaga sa expectation natin. Okay? Kaya nga, kung di equal yung expectation mo with the actual MOH, you have to do some adjustments. So what do we do with the over or under applied na overhead? At paano ba natin na-determine ang over or under applied? Okay? Ay, wait lang, balik lang ako dito. Madalas po natatanong sa theories, sa maraming exams na encounter ko, sinasabi dito na ang MOH, most of the debits are yung mga debits ng MOH ay para talaga sa, nasa choices doon, ang answer doon ay actual MOH. Kasi di ba, ang MOH na credit minsan lang kapag nag-apply ka to overhead. Ay, nag-apply ka to production. Okay? Balik tayo dito. So problems of overhead application. So the difference between the overhead cost applied to work in process and the actual overhead cost of a period is referred to as either underapplied or overapplied. Ang tanong, favorable ba or unfavorable? Paano mo malalaman? So pag underapplied, ibig sabihin we have the MOH actual and then the MOH na applied. If under-applied, ibig sabihin, about 80,000 ang applied, 100,000 ang actual. So under-applied tayo ng 20,000. Is it favorable or unfavorable? Paano mo maiisip kung favorable or unfavorable? Nag-apply ka ng 80,000, ibig sabihin, ito yung ginamit mo na cost, na-estimate mo ng cost ng product. Pero nung lumabas yung actual, 100,000 pala, kulang. So yung under-applied pala ay unfavorable. Kapag ang isang bagay ay unfavorable, tumataas lalo yung cost natin. Diba? Kasi we have to adjust yung MOH applied natin papunta na sa actual. Pero ang kainaman nga lang talaga, ulitin ko lang, sa MOH applied kasi ito na-determine na natin agad yung cost ng product at the end of the period. Pero kapag actual kasi, kahit tapos na yung period, hindi pa tapos yung pag-accumulate natin ng tirod. Hindi pa tapos yung kompletong data natin ng tirod, puro estimate. Ang meron lang tayo dito ay yung estimate natin. So under-applied, unfavorable. Madaling tandaan, parehas naman na U. Under-applied, unfavorable. MOH actual, 100,000. But you applied, MOH applied, pangit na nasulat, 120,000. So may 20,000 tayo na over-applied. Paano ba siya i-analyze? In-estimate mo na 120,000 yung ating overhead. Okay? Pero it turned out na 100,000 lang pala. So nataasan natin yung cost natin. So eventually, pati yung selling price natin tumaas din. Okay naman sana sa atin kasi favorable siya kasi ang actual cost lang talaga ay 100,000. However, maaring favorable siya right now kasi yung cost mo ay bumaba. Pero eventually, since hindi mo rin kasi na-estimate na mabuti yung MOH mo, manufacturing overhead mo, affected po somehow yung relationship mo with your customers. Imagine, na-overprice natin yung ating product. Hindi naman nila alam siyempre nangyari sa MOH actual and applied. Pero of course, mas alam mo naman ang prices kapag tumataas lalo, yung demand o yung customers natin, most likely ang reaction would buy less sa iyo. Pero if your price is lower, so syempre, ang reaction ng customers, they will buy more from you. Okay, so going back sa over or under applied. So pag under applied, it's unfavorable. Over applied, it's favorable. But tulad ng sinabi na, hindi pa pala natin sinasabi, but whether favorable or unfavorable, we really have to check what happened. Kasi ang mas gusto nating mangyari dito, yung estimate natin or yung applied natin is really near the actual. Okay? So as time goes by, yung ating namang pag-estimate ng overhead would be closer and closer to actual. Kasi with the experience that we had, with the historical data that we had, we can have more basis in estimating our overhead or in coming up with our predetermined overhead rate. Okay? So let's continue. So yung same data kanina. So peer cost, actual overhead for the year was 650,000 with a total of 170,000 direct labor hours on the jobs. How much total overhead was applied to peer cost jobs during the year? So we have to use again yung ating predetermined overhead rate na 4 per direct labor hours. Okay? But just to recall, saan nanggaling yung 4 na direct labor hours? 640, ay hindi masyadong kita. 640,000 po yung estimated natin. Over 160,000 na estimated na direct labor hours. Ito yung estimated overhead to get the POHR or predetermined overhead rate. Kaya nag-come up tayo with, it's not peso. Sorry naman, naka-dollars nga pala tayo. Dollars. So that's why we came up with $4 per DLH. Kasi nasa kabilang slide. So I just showed you again where we got the predetermined overhead rate. But the actual overhead was $650,000. Tinatanong dito, magkano ba yung over or under applied natin? Some of the students would think na ang over or under applied natin ay yung difference ng 640 and 615. No. Ito po ay estimated overhead. Pero hindi po yun yung applied natin. This is your actual. Pero paano natin makukuha yung applied ng overhead natin? Ano ba yung formula natin last time? Kanina lang pala. So ang applied overhead natin is overhead rate, predetermined overhead rate times the actual level of activity. Ano ba yung actual level natin? Ay ano ba yung predetermined overhead rate natin? Di ba $4? Ano ba yung actual level of activity natin? Ito po, kung ano yung cost driver natin, ano ba yung actual nun? 170,000 direct labor hours. Pero nawawala yung 4 dito. Kaya ano nangyari? Ayan. So $4 times 170,000. So magkano po ang ating applied overhead? That is $680,000. Okay. Kapag itong dalawa ang pinagbasihan mo, nagmukha tayo na under-applied. Pero kung totoo, we are over-applied by how much? Oh, sorry. Over-applied by how much? 650 and 680, $30,000. Is it favorable or unfavorable? It is favorable. Okay? Kung favorable to, what do we expect sa cost? Dapat bumaba. Okay? So pag papababain ng cost, pag ginawan mo ng entry yan, is it debited or credited? So dapat naka-credit. Pag favorable, dapat naka-credit ang cost of sales. Pero kapag unfavorable, naka-debit dapat. So tingnan po natin yung next slide. Okay? So, yan. So PeerCo has over-applied overhead of for the year by $30,000. So ito yung sinabi natin na answer natin kanina. Now, anong entry natin? Di ba sabi natin favorable? para madaling tandaan. Anong gagawin sa cost pag favorable? Bababaan kasi pabor. Kaya naman, para babaan, naka-credit ang cost of goods sold. Ano yung ide-debit mo? Yung manufacturing overhead na applied. Remember, na sobra, ang entry mo kasi kanina, hindi ko pala nabigay entry kanina, I'm so sorry. Doon sa $680, debit, work in process, and credit, manufacturing overhead. Ito po yung applied natin. Okay? Magkano? $680,000. $680,000. Ang ating actual overhead ay debit, manufacturing overhead, and credit, various accounts na 650. Okay? Yan po yung original entry natin. If we go back to the previous slide, ito po, yung 650 na to, yung actual daw na overhead, ha? Ayan, so balik lang po ako dun sa slides ng solution natin. Ayan. So, pag tinignan mo, MOH na credit 680, MOH na debit 650. So may 30 dapat na i-close. Kung makikita mo, MOH naman parehas yan. Ito po, nilagyan ko lang ng label, ito po yung actual. MOH parehas yan. So hindi sila balanse. So dapat ma-zero out mo, you have to close yung over or under applied to cost of goods sold. Okay? Generally, if the over or under applied is immaterial, i-close mo sa cost of goods sold. Immaterial. Mamaya na natin pag-usapan kapag material. So going back, favorable, so credit ang cost of goods sold, i-debit mo yung manufacturing overhead, yung para sa applied. Kasi nasobrahan. So babawasan mo yung applied. Okay? So that's 30,000. So kung unfavorable yan, so debit, cost of goods sold, and credit, MOH. Para sa applied din po. Okay? Kung unfavorable. Ito kasi yung scenario na favorable. Alright? Ayan. So, yan ay kapag immaterial cost of goods sold. So, syempre, paano kung material yung variance natin? Erase ko lang ng konti, yung part na to. So, kapag material, yung variance natin, i-close natin sa lahat ng accounts na merong overhead. Ano ba yung accounts na merong overhead? Raw materials, may overhead ba? Wala naman. Yung work in process, may overhead component yan. Yung finished goods, may overhead component yan. Yung cost of goods sold, may overhead component yan. Lahat na yan ay may DMDLOH, DMDLOH, DMDLOH. So lahat ay may OH. So we will close to these three accounts. How? First, based on their OH balances. Paano based on their OH balances? Kung magkano may OH nila, you are going to allocate, naka-prorate po yung over or under applied overhead natin sa balances nila. Number two, kung hindi mo clearly ma-identify yung overhead balances nila, naka-base po sa ending balances nila. Kung magkano may end. Okay? So, paano? Ikakalat mo lang yung 30,000. Paano ba ikinakalat? I'll just give you an example. Yung mas madali-daling figures. Okay? So, let's say for example, na 30,000 to. Ngayon, I'll erase itong dinagdag ko na data dito para maikalat lang natin. Ayan. Let us say for example, na ang balances nito ay 100,000. Ito ay 500,000. Ang COGS ay hindi makatotohanan. Ito po ay 300,000. Ang COGS ay 600,000. Ayan. So ang total po ng OH balances natin, for example, ay 1 million pesos. We are going to allocate the 30,000 na over-applied sa tatlo na yan. How do we allocate? 30,000 po ito. So, 100 over 1 million and 30,000 ay 3,000. So, 300,000 divided by 1 million times 30,000. Ipo-prorate lang po natin, ratio and proportion po natin. So, that would be 9,000. Ay, tama ba ang math natin? Ayan. So, 600,000 over 1 million times 30,000. So, that would be 18,000. Ayan. So, ibig sabihin, that will be the adjustment kay WIP, kay FGI, at saka kay cost of goods sold. Magkano na ngayon yung balance nung tatlo na yan? over-applied po tayo. So, kung over-applied po tayo, dapat babaan natin, di ba? Over-applied, favorable, babaan ng COGS. Dito po tayo mas madaling makakapag-recognize kung anong magiging bagong balanse. It will now become 97,000. Ito naman po ay 291,000. It will now become 582,000. Yan na po yung bagong cost of goods sold natin. Anong entry natin para ma-close itong 30,000 na over-applied? Debit. Manufacturing overhead. Magkano? 30,000. Ano pa? Credit po lahat to. Work in process. Finished goods inventory and cost of goods sold. Oops, sana maayos pa ang ating sulat. Cost of goods sold. Ayan. Magkano work in process natin dito? 3,000 ang credit natin. Tapos 9,000 kay finished goods. Tapos 18,000 kay cost of goods sold. Okay? So in other words, yung 30,000 hindi lahat inabsorb or klinos kay cost of goods sold. Yung 30,000, dinistribute mo sa tatlong accounts na merong overhead components. So that's the disposition of under or over-applied overhead. Okay? So, oops, end of the study. So thank you very much for attending today's session. I think we could end now the recording session.